Good morning and welcome, everyone, and a very happy Easter to all of you, to each and every one of you. I hope you're all doing very well. So today I'm going to reflect with you on the meaning of Easter, and then we'll read and discuss the famous story from Luke 24, the road to Emmaus, and then we'll have time for questions and conversation. We'll go an hour and a half or more if you want. And just to remind you also, please keep yourselves muted. But then you can write questions and comments in the chat and write to each other if you want as we go along. Ruth Ann is here and she can help with any technical difficulties. We're also recording this, and tomorrow or Monday we will send you the recording links so you can watch it again if you want. And good, so let's begin with a little prayer. So I invite you to take a moment in silence and just take a deep breath and relax and notice how you're feeling this morning. And let's enter into the presence of the God of peace who loves you infinitely. And let's welcome the risen Jesus here into our hearts and into our Zoom community. And let's take a moment to ask for whatever Easter graces we need. So we'll pray. God of peace, thank you for all the blessings of life and love, but most of all for the resurrection of the nonviolent Jesus. Bless us now as we reflect on his resurrection, that we might always welcome his resurrection gift of peace, that we might always share his Easter graces, peace, hope, and joy, and that we too might be witnesses and apostles of resurrection peace, and therefore do our part to help end war, poverty, racism, nuclear weapons, systemic violence, and environmental destruction, and welcome your reign of peace on earth. We ask this mighty blessing in the name of the risen Jesus. So again, a very big, warm welcome to you. I just love the Easter season, and for me, it's just been, well, I don't know even how to talk about it. It's critical. I don't know what we do without resurrection. I have many, many close friends who do not believe in God and do not believe in resurrection at all. And they think I'm crazy, and they're wonderful people. And I don't know how you can go through life without resurrection. I remember when I was in college and I was always growing up thinking about death, which is my problem. It's always been my stumbling block. And I thought, well, when I was in college, I thought one day, well, when I die, I believe I'm going to go and meet God. I'm going to be overwhelmed by love and light and peace. And I'm going to meet Jesus, and he's going to be risen, and he's going to be great and happy and loving and peaceful and joyful and welcoming. And he's going to say, and what did you do with your gift of life, with your time on earth? And that question got through to me, and I began to think, well, I better do something so I can be ready to meet Jesus. And it's really challenged me to become a priest and a Jesuit and to work for peace and justice. I say all that because two very close friends of mine died this week. And, you know, it just seems so many people are dying these days. One was Richard Dietz, my friend at the Fellowship of Reconciliation, who was very close with Martin King and Coretta Scott King, and who worked all over the world to teach nonviolence through the Fellowship of Reconciliation. He was just amazing. He should be world famous. My other friend was Ramsey Clark, who died last night. He was the former Attorney General under Kennedy and Johnson. And so he was I'm very good friends of mine with Daniel Berrigan, and for 35 years. And we used to have dinner every 3 months together for many years. And he was my lawyer during my Plowshares trial and many other trials. And I think of them now being welcomed by the risen Jesus into paradise, and they're telling him about their big lives. But that's about as far as I've got. So that's why I like to reflect on Easter and resurrection with you, because it's a mystery. And yet And we don't have that much to go on about it in the Gospels. There's just, really, John has a lot, but Mark, he doesn't rise from the dead in the Gospel of Mark. If you read the fine print, verses 16, verses 1 to 9, it just says there's an empty tomb and the women run away because the angel said, he'll meet you all back in Galilee. And Mark is saying, if you want to meet the risen Jesus, you got to start your own journey from Galilee to Jerusalem, which is why they're terrified. It's amazing. So brilliant writing. And anyway, Luke has this great big story of the road to Emmaus, and that's what I thought we could look at today. Here's basically kind of what I think that, my thesis, if we're looking at Jesus from the perspective of Gandhian nonviolence, Kingian nonviolence, that Gandhi said Jesus is the greatest person of nonviolence in history, that he taught the spectacular vision of nonviolence in the Sermon on the Mount, and that he practiced and preached meticulous nonviolence everywhere he went, and he marched to Jerusalem, and he resisted injustice and violence and empire, and he did civil disobedience at the temple, and he gave us the Eucharist, and what happened? What did we do to him? We arrested him, tortured him, killed him. And he comes back and he says to his friends, peace be with you, peace be with you, peace be with you. Now you go and walk the road of nonviolence and be a peacemaker to your own modern day Jerusalem. And wow, I find that very moving and challenging and life-giving, let's get up and go. So that's what I want to reflect on today, the resurrection in light of the nonviolence that Gandhi and Dr. King taught. And I want to invite you today, this weekend, in the weeks ahead in Easter season as we await Pentecost, to really go and be with the risen Jesus and talk to him and listen to him and feel his presence and receive his resurrection gift of peace and let him send you forth again to carry on his mission. Now, for those of you who know me, I always have questions. It's one of my major problems. And I have tons of questions, so I'm going to give them to you now, and I'm going to give them to you at the end if you want to write these down. But my thought is that you could sit with them and pray on them and reflect on them. So here's the first one. They're all very simple and therefore impossible. After all you've been through, after all our lives, here we are in the lockdown in the pandemic, at this stage in your life today, what does resurrection mean for you? Because it would probably have evolved over our life, or we've deepened and matured in it, or maybe we have more doubts than ever. Where are you with the question of the meaning of resurrection? Or to put it another way, what does the resurrection of the nonviolent Jesus mean for you? What's the connection between resurrection and nonviolence, which is what Gandhi insisted? So if Jesus is totally nonviolent and raised from the dead and alive and well, and you and I are his followers, what difference does it make in our lives? In other words, how are you and I living differently because of the resurrection of Jesus from those who don't believe in the resurrection of Jesus? What do you think about that? And in other words, how are you a witness of the risen Jesus, which is the big word that we're going to hear today? Let me see here for a second. Yeah, I think you're still all listening to me. I think we're still connected. After years in the Jesuits, I used to joke, well, if it were me and I was the savior of the world, let's ponder that. And I came down here and I explained everything perfectly to you. Here's how you love everyone, you make peace, nonviolence. I gave you this Sermon on the Mount. I healed everybody. I led a campaign to end the empire. And what did you do? You betrayed me, you denied me, you abandoned me, you arrested me, you tried me, you tortured me, and you executed me. And I went up to heaven and God said, I need you to go back there. I'd say, I'm not going back down there. There's no way. I don't know if you've ever thought about that. When I think about that, I'd be resentful for several thousand years, or at least I'd be really mad at Peter. How could you do this to me? And as I said to the other group recently, we get mad at the smallest, most ridiculous, most inconsequential things. We have so much resentment over such minor things. Jesus comes back, peace be with you, peace be with you, peace be with you. It's amazing. If Gandhi was right that he was the most nonviolent person in history, then his resurrection is probably best understood still from the perspective of nonviolence. And it means then that Jesus was totally nonviolent during his life. We killed him and he comes back and he's still totally nonviolent, infinitely gentle, infinitely compassionate, loving, forgiveness, not a trace of anger, not a drop of resentment or bitterness or revenge or retaliation. You see, this is really important to reflect on it this way. And that's why the gang changes. They realize they're all forgiven and they say, right, we're going to throw our whole lot in with this guy. And they all become martyrs. They gave their lives to carry on this campaign of nonviolence. And so where are we in that story? And it's a wonderful question. I don't know if my friend Bill Wiley-Kellerman is on the call yet. I can't see whether he's there or not, but he's supposed to be. Anyway, we are friends of Daniel Berrigan, and you may have heard that on May 8th, I'm doing a special Zoom for Dan's 100th birthday. And Bill has a new book out on Dan Berrigan. And so it's an amazing book. And Bill's going to respond to my reflections on Dan on May 8th. But I was telling Bill, of all the people I've known, I consider Daniel Berrigan maybe the greatest witness of the resurrection. He kind of lived resurrection. Our friend Peter is on this Zoom, and I think, Peter, you know what I mean. Just there's also his joy. There was a deep peace, and he loved to have a party with friends. That's the way I envision the risen Jesus. And that's how I want to live. We all want to be followers of the risen Jesus and be getting ready for resurrection, which means standing up against death. Well, in my book, Daniel Berrigan, Essential Writings, I end with a few texts that Dan wrote on resurrection, which I've always thought were the greatest writings on resurrection that I've ever read. So I'm going to read a long Dan Berrigan quote, which is part funny and part shocking. And it's in my book, Daniel Berrigan, Essential Writings, if you wanted to get it. I found this quote. There's only one copy of it, I think, in the whole planet, in a really obscure encyclopedia of writers, if you can imagine. It's called like the Autobiography Encyclopedia, and it's 40 volumes. And Dan, famous writers are asked to write about themselves for this encyclopedia. And Dan had one copy of it and gave it to a Jesuit friend. And 36 years ago, I borrowed it for a while. And I Xeroxed this. And that's where I found this quote. So that's a long introduction, but I want you to listen really carefully to Daniel Berrigan's take on the resurrection. So here goes. Once there was a dead man, a criminal, a subject of capital punishment, and lo, he refused to stay dead. He stood up. As the authorities shortly came to sense this was an earthquake in nature, in the nature of law and order, in the nature of death, in the nature of war. For in the nature of things as defined by the nation state, a great one for deciding what the nature of things is, dead men stay dead. The word from Big Brother, the word that gives him clout, inspires fear is a criminal once disposed of stays disposed. Not at all. Along come these crazies shouting in public, our guy's not dead. He's risen. Isn't that great? Now, I submit, this is Daniel Berrigan, you can't have such a word going around and still run the state properly. The first nonviolent revolution was, of course, the resurrection. The event had to include death as its first act, and also the command to Peter, put up your sword, so that it might be clear once and for all that Christians suffer death rather than inflict it. Christians suffer death rather than inflict it. All worldly systems and arrangements are bypassed by the resurrection. If from now on death has no hold over people, in the sense that they're now exorcised from their fear of death, then what's left worth fearing or worth hoping from any worldly structure? All the worldly structures from now on to serve the feisty appellation conferred on them by Dorothy Day, the filthy, rotten system. Everything is part of the filthy, rotten system, Dorothy Day said. Here's Dana. I take it she was referring to their main function, multiplying the metaphors and means of death. The end of such a world, as she realized and regarded it, was not only near. The end of the culture of death, the power of death, has already occurred. Isn't that fantastic, everybody? Bill Wiley Kellerman, isn't that great? I'm reading Dan. I was talking about you before you came on here. That's my favorite quote on the resurrection. And it's in my book, Daniel Berrigan, Essential Writings. Along come these crazies shouting, our guy's not dead. You can't run this state with somebody running around saying that. That's where we are. So I want to sum up Dan's take on the resurrection. This is the basis for all of Dan's peacemaking life, was the resurrection, the resurrection. So if the crucifixion, the execution of Jesus by the Roman Empire was totally legal, then the resurrection of the nonviolent Jesus is totally illegal. And it's the greatest act of civil disobedience in history. And Dan says the most perfect nonviolent revolution in history. So this is really important to think on. The only power the empire has over us as peacemakers, that has over Gandhi and Dorothy Day and Dr. King and Oscar Romero and all our saints, is the power of death. They can kill us, or as Dan says, the metaphors and means of death. They can arrest us and they can put us in jail. But Dan says Jesus has taken the power of death away from now on. So we have nothing to fear from now on. We go on in total hope and peace and trust and nonviolence, and we keep speaking out against the empire and war and nukes and injustice and calling for a new culture of justice and disarmament and peace. That's my take on the resurrection story. Dan would say that the whole human race is addicted to violence and death. But when you reflect on the story of the resurrection of Jesus from a Gandhian Kingian hermeneutic of nonviolence, and this is my own thinking, my own having done the math after listening to Dan for 40 years. He never said this, but this was my conclusion from listening to him. This is my definition of resurrection. So Bill Kellerman, buckle your seatbelts. I want to know if you agree with me later. Resurrection means having nothing to do with death. Resurrection means then not having a trace of violence within you. Resurrection means then total nonviolence, the fullness of life. So, which means as followers of the risen nonviolent Jesus, as people getting ready for resurrection, we're trying not to have a drop of violence in us, but to be instead totally nonviolent, totally peaceful, full of compassion and love and life, and resisting the state and all those who inflict death on our sisters and brothers. So we want to share the resurrection of the nonviolent Jesus. We've got to keep renouncing violence within us and being totally nonviolent, but working for nonviolent, but be working for a new nonviolent world. Now, if you don't like that, here's another way to put it. The resurrection of the nonviolent Jesus for us, his followers, means buckle your seatbelts. Our survival is already guaranteed. Do we really believe that? That's what Gandhi wrestled with. And that's why Gandhi in 1903 professed a vow of fearlessness, never to be afraid for 1 second for the rest of his life, because he was a follower of the risen nonviolent Jesus. So we can go forward and we can resist death and the culture of death and live life to the full and keep speaking out. And they can do whatever they want with us. They can even arrest us and jail us or kill us like Dr. King and Gandhi and Romero. But we know our survival is already guaranteed. We are resurrection people. And one day we're going to be with the risen Jesus and all our relatives and all the saints and all the peacemakers. So we're going to just get on with the work that Jesus has for us now. Okay, all that's my preliminary stuff for Luke 24. I hope that was helpful. That's kind of where I'm coming from and about the best I've thought of after 40 years of thinking about resurrection and nonviolence. So I'm going to read to you the story of Luke 24. So I invite you to sit back and listen carefully, or you can read along. I'm going to get to the end of the meal, and then I'll talk about it. And then I'm going to read the appearance in the upper room, the rest of Luke 24, talk about that, and then we'll open it up for questions and comments and reflections and rebuttal if necessary. Okay, so this is the Gospel, Luke chapter 24, verse 1. At daybreak, on the first day of the week, they took the spices they had prepared and went to the tomb. And they found the stone rolled away from the tomb, but when they entered, they did not find the body of the Lord Jesus. While they were puzzling over this, behold, two men in dazzling garments appeared to them. They were terrified and bowed their faces to the ground, but they said to them, "Why do you seek the living among the dead? He is not here, but he has been raised. Remember what he said to you while he was still in Galilee, that the Son of Man must be handed over to sinners and be crucified, and rise on the third day." And they remembered his words. Then they returned from the tomb and announced all these things to the 11 and to all the others. The women were Mary Magdalene, Joanna, and Mary, the mother of James. The others who accompanied them were also told this to the apostles, but their story seemed like nonsense, and they did not believe them. But Peter got up and ran to the tomb and bent down and saw the burial cloths, and he went home amazed at what happened. Okay. Now that very day, two of them were going to a village 7 miles from Jerusalem called Emmaus, and they were conversing about all the things that had occurred. And it happened that while they were conversing and debating, Jesus himself drew near and walked with them, but their eyes were prevented from recognizing him. And he asked them, "What are you discussing as you walk along?" They stopped, looking downcast. One of them, named Cleopas, said to him in reply, "Are you the only visitor to Jerusalem who does not know of the things that have taken place there in these days?" And he replied to them, "What things?" And they said to him, "The things that happened to Jesus the Nazarene, who is a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, how our chief priests and rulers both handed him over to a sentence of death and crucified him. We had hoped that he would be the one to redeem Israel. Besides all this, it is now the third day since this took place, and some women from our group, however, have astounded us. They were at the tomb early this morning and did not find his body. And they came back and reported that they indeed seen a vision of angels who announced that he was alive. Then some of those with us went to the tomb and found things just as the women had described, but him they did not see. And he said to them, "Oh, how foolish you are, how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets spoke. Was it not necessary that the Messiah should suffer these things and enter into his glory?" Then, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them what referred to him in all the scriptures. As they approached the village, he gave the impression that he was going on further, but they urged him, "Stay with us, for it is nearly evening and the day is almost over." So he went in to stay with them. And it happened that while he was at table with them, he took bread, said the blessing, broke it, and gave it to them. And with that, their eyes were opened and they recognized him, but he vanished from their sight. And they said to each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he spoke to us on the way and opened the scriptures to us?" So they set out at once and returned to Jerusalem, where they found gathered together the 11 and those with them who were saying, "The Lord has been truly raised and has appeared to Simon." Then the two recounted what had taken place on the way and how he was made known to them and the breaking of the bread. It's such a beautiful story. So I just kind of want to walk through it with you and just point out a few things for your reflection. And then I'll read the rest of the story and then talk about that. It's the famous road to Emmaus, which we've heard all our lives, but I don't think you can ever hear enough. And wherever we are at this point in our lives, I guess my question for you is, where are you in the story? How is the road to Emmaus your story? So there they are, these two crestfallen disciples who, by the way, I think were his aunt and uncle, but that's another story. Cleopas is referred to, and they're both referred to later on in other places in the New Testament. But they're leaving Jerusalem, which means they're walking down the road from the city after Jesus' horrific torture and execution, and they're afraid, and they're grief-stricken, and they're all confused, but they're totally depressed, and they're going to the village, and that means they're leaving the community. They're giving up, which means they're walking in total despair. That's the key for me to understand the story. And Jesus sidles up to them, but they don't recognize him. He's risen from the dead, but they don't see that it's him. And he asks them so gently, it's just an amazing question. "What are you discussing as you walk along?" And they stop. Like, are you kidding me? Are you the only person in Jerusalem who does not know the things that have happened there in the last few days? And the risen Jesus asked one of the most astonishing questions in the entire Bible and in the history of the world. Did you notice it? What things? What things? It's just utterly amazing to me. 20 years ago, I wrote a whole book called The Questions of Jesus. And, you know, if you add up all the four Gospels, he asks about, I don't remember the exact number, it's like 350 questions. And only 2 of them does he answer. The question is just left there. And I wrote a whole book on the questions, and you can get it on Amazon or Doubleday. But this is my favorite question because I invite you to think about it. You know, if it were me, that's why I keep saying, what would you do if I were arrested and tortured and killed, and then I died, and I went to heaven, and then I came back, and I rose from the dead, and I appeared to my friends? I'd go, you see how I am. I'd go, you wouldn't believe just what happened to me. They killed me, and then I went up to heaven, and now I've come back, and I'm alive. I'd be talking nonstop, as you all know about me. But Jesus responds, what things? What things? This is a very powerful instruction. And it's a glimpse into who our risen, nonviolent Jesus is. How humble he is, and peaceful, and mindful, and centered, nonviolent. It's a glimpse of resurrection. This is very, very important, I think, because he didn't have to talk like that. He wants us to do the talking, and he wants to listen to us. And he's trying to help us express our feelings through all that's happened to him. But he never overwhelms us or imposes himself on us like I do, like we do. He's much more gentle. Here's the catch, I think, and you can reflect on this and tell me if I'm wrong, but he wants us to tell him his story in our lives. He wants to hear our experience of him in our lives. Tell me about me in your life. Something like that, which is very disarming and very healing. We get to tell him about our experience of the Paschal mystery, of him, his presence in our lives, to share our journey, and he's right there with us. So they launch into the whole thing. You would not believe what happened. He was arrested, tortured, crushed, defeated, executed, and now it's all over and there's no more hope and Jesus is gone. And this is the second big point I wanted to share with you about this. I think this is in my book, Jesus the Rebel. This is a test of your verb tenses, Bill Kellerman and everybody. The past pluperfect. The past pluperfect. It's a critical detail in the Road to Emmaus story. I submit. The two downcast disciples say to the original, in the original Greek, to the risen Jesus, in the verb tense, the past pluperfect, we had hope. We had hoped. We had hoped things were going to get better. We had hoped things would change. We had hoped he would be the one. And we had hoped war and killing and empire would end. We had hoped justice would finally be done for the poor, that humanity would live in peace and care for the poor, protect creation. We had hoped he would lead us to peace. We had hoped, but we were wrong. Once we have had hope, but now we have none, because there is no hope. This is really important. This is the climax of the entire Gospel of Luke. And they say to the risen Jesus, we had hoped, but now we know there is no hope. This is total rock bottom despair, the despair of no hope whatsoever, the climax of the story. There is no hope. Our best hope was killed, so all hope is gone. I think that if you want to go deep into the mystery of resurrection, you want to experience the risen Jesus, if you want to experience the resurrection of the saints and our friends and relatives, you have to go deep into that place within where you have given up all hope and sit there and tell the risen Jesus about it. Tell him there's no hope, not for ourselves or our loved ones or the country or the world or even for Mother Earth now. So if we want to taste the hope of resurrection, perhaps we need to recognize and name our despair and tell him so he can work with us. Because that's probably deep down in the basement of our hearts, still some lingering despair. And he's come to turn the tables over our despair. I don't know about you, but like me, I've certainly used the past pluperfect many times, or maybe it's even running subconsciously in my mind. Are you the only person, Jesus, who doesn't see the things that are happening in the world? I mean, just look. Permanent warfare, Donald Trump, Yemen, Syria, Palestine, the death of my friends this week. We've got thousands of nuclear weapons on hair trigger alert. We're digging up fossil fuels all over the place and hastening climate change. Our country is stealing resources all over the world. We beat and kill unarmed African-American men like George Floyd. 4 billion people live under $2 a day. We're just destroying each other and the whole planet. Few people care about your way of peace and love, Jesus, or whoever you are, much less nonviolence as a social methodology for change. You inspired us to try to do something, but now we know nothing can be done. We had hoped. We had hoped your reign of peace would break through. We had hoped you would do something or get us to do something. We think you're a very nice guy, Jesus, but now we know there is no hope. I'm trying to articulate for us the sense of despair living in a world of total death. And I think we have to open our eyes and name it and look at it. At least that's what I say my friend Daniel Berrigan did. If we want to experience the risen Jesus, or better yet, practice resurrection. Why? Because the risen Jesus doesn't buy it for a second. Absolutely not. You know, he always is in your face, and he challenges our despair. This is powerful. How foolish you are. He's not putting you down. He's going, come on, man. How slow you are to believe. I mean, even look at all the prophets. You didn't believe Isaiah or Jeremiah or Gandhi or Dorothy Day or Dr. King. Well, don't you get the story by now? Was it not necessary that the Messiah should suffer these things and enter into his glory? That's a tough sentence for me. Was it not necessary? Necessary that our guy should be so brutally tortured and killed? Well, in a world of torture and death, he sides with all the victims of death and is raising all of us. You could say, well, what difference did it make? The world is so full of injustice and violence and war. Now we're in the verge of catastrophic climate change. We've never experienced this before. Like the whole world is going to be destroyed, and the number of wars will be permanent, and so forth. And so, and meanwhile, the church is a mess. It continues to bless and justify war. No, it seems like things are worse. No, it was not necessary that the Messiah should suffer so terribly. But see, that's when we are naming, we are exposing the fact that we don't believe in nonviolence, that we still somehow want a domineering or violent Messiah. Deep down, you know, if you say, you know, it wasn't necessary, there was a better way, then we haven't understood nonviolence. So the death of Martin Luther King has led to so much more around the world. This is a conversation I've had with all of King's friends, including Jim Lawson recently. It led to so many more things, you know. Martyrdom bears good fruit. So Jesus refuses to cooperate with our despair. That's why I'm suggesting you go and you name your despair and tell him your despair. Because he's the embodiment of hope. He's beyond hope. And all the social and economic and political implications of hope. He's crucified and now he's alive. And it's like he starts all over with these two close friends of his, these two disciples. And he goes back to the basics of the salvation story. Okay, goes to the scriptures. Okay, there was Moses, and then there were the prophets and the Psalms, and they all pointed to me. And he's explaining the lineage, the biblical path of nonviolence leading up to him, the fullness of the God of peace. And he's showing that the Paschal mystery is redemptive, or as Martin Luther King said, unearned suffering love is always redemptive. That his suffering nonviolent love is going to win over every human heart in history and disarm us all. So he's saying, the way I translate what he says to Cleopas and his wife, I believe, his friends, is Christ has not failed. The empire is falling. Death has lost its power. The culture of violence is coming to an end. War is over if you want it, as John Lennon said. The old world is falling away. My way of nonviolence works, and it can be a tool for nonviolent revolution and nonviolent transformation for a more nonviolent world, if you dare believe and go forth and use it. Even creation's going to be renewed. Suffering accepted in love in pursuit of truth and justice in the global struggle bears immeasurable pursuit if only you believe and go for it for the long haul. Or as Dr. King said, quoting the great poet, truth crushed to earth will rise again. Isn't that wonderful? But so to carry on what he said to the disciples, I think when he explains the movement of God through the scriptures up to himself, today we can continue to explain that story of the lineage from the early church and how the gang got into the nonviolence movement and helped bring down the empire, to the desert fathers and mothers, once Constantine converted, who kept nonviolence alive, to then the monastic movements, which were very important, to then Francis and Clare and the Franciscan movement, which I think by bringing nonviolence back alive helped end feudalism, to then all the movements from the abolitionists and the suffragists, the labor movement, to Gandhi, and Gandhi's incredible effect on the human race, showing the power of nonviolence to bring down the British Empire nonviolently. Dr. King and the civil rights movement, then to everybody, Dorothy Day, the women's movement, the environmental movement, the anti-apartheid movement, all the nonviolent movements that brought down the Berlin Wall and the Soviet Union, there's thousands of them that continue to quietly change the world today, one movement at a time, right? What's happening right now in Myanmar, for example. This is the work of the risen Jesus and of his Holy Spirit. So the two disciples, when they hear all this, they're just gobsmacked. They're utterly astonished. So they say, come on in and have a meal. And he takes the bread and blesses it and breaks it and shares it. And they recognize him. And I remember somebody telling me that that's why they recognize him, because that's what their friend always did every day they were with him. At every meal, he took the bread and blessed it and broke it and shared. That was his way. And now we know it as the Eucharist. And they say, were not our hearts burning as he opened the scriptures? That's another great question to sit with. What makes your heart burn as you hear this gospel story and read the scriptures and reflect on the lineage of Jesus up through today and Dr. King and Dorothy Day and Gandhi? So they immediately get up and set back to Jerusalem, and the road of despair becomes the road of hope. I love that. The road from violence's apparent victory turns around and becomes now the road of daring act of nonviolence. They go back to the scene of crime. The road of fear becomes the road of fearlessness and universal nonviolent love. They're going to take the message to the streets. The road of death turns around and becomes the road of new life, the road of resurrection. I just love all this. So my question is, when did Jesus sidle up to you? When have you had those moments in your life that you've realized that you're in the presence of the risen Jesus? You know, a lot of preachers talk about how he comes to us these days as a stranger, a refugee, an immigrant, an outcast, a homeless person, a prisoner, a sick person, a dying person. I would especially say in the movements for peace and justice. When was the last time you felt your heart burning? What makes you turn around from despair and fill you with hope and send you back to join the struggle? So now I'll read the conclusion of the story and make a few comments about it. If you're still all there with me, everybody, this is the end of chapter 24. While they were still speaking about this, he stood in their midst and said to them, "Peace be with you." They were startled and terrified and thought they were seeing a ghost. And he said to them, "Why are you troubled? Why do these questions arise in your hearts? Look at my hands and my feet, that it is I myself. Touch me and see, because a ghost does not have flesh and bones as you see I have." And as he said this, he showed them his hands and his feet. While they were still incredulous for joy and were amazed, he asked them, "Have you anything here to eat?" They gave him a piece of baked fish. He took it and ate it in front of them. And he said to them, "These are my words that I spoke to you while I was still with you, that everything written about me in the law of Moses and in the prophets and in the Psalms must be fulfilled." And he opened their minds to understand the scriptures. And he said to them, thus it is written that the Messiah would suffer and rise from the dead on the third day, and that repentance for the forgiveness of sins would be preached in his name to all the nations, beginning from Jerusalem. You are witnesses of these things. Wow, I just love all that. Isn't that great? So they arrive, they meet the community, they tell them they met Jesus on the road, and then he appears to them in their midst and says the famous greeting, the same thing he told them to say when he sent them out in Luke 10, peace be with you, peace be with you, peace be with you. And you notice he shows them his wounds. And later in John's gospel, he says, peace be with you, shows them the wounds and says, peace be with you again. So I want to just make a few points here. The first thing I want to point out is that if you, and this sounds so simple, but it's only really hit me probably in the last 10 years. If you and I really want to be resurrection people, followers of the risen Jesus, we really have to welcome and receive and accept and embrace his resurrection gift of peace. When he says, peace be with you, we have to say, okay, I'm going to take it. Thank you. I am going to live with your peace in my heart from now on. And not just till I die, but through eternity. No matter what happens, no matter what problems or crises we face, we're going to remain in the peace of Christ and stay peaceful and live in peace with the peacemaking Christ. I think very, very few people in history want his resurrection gift of peace. Or to put it even stronger, we've all rejected it, but it's still being offered to us so we can go back and accept it. I guess my question is, do you want it? How badly do you want to live in peace? That's, I've been talking about peace for 45 years, and you keep learning more and more and go deeper and deeper. What does accepting his resurrection gift of peace mean for you? I really invite you to think about that as like one of your goals for the rest of your life, to live in the gift of resurrection, which is a very, very deep peace. For me, that's why I've been helped so much by Thich Nhat Hanh, that Buddhism, as Merton said too, really can help you deepen in peace. Like nothing will trouble you. I'm going to keep referring to that, I think. Second, so this peace of resurrection is connected to the wounds. He says, peace be with you, and he shows us his wounds. So again, if you want to share in the peace of the risen Christ, we have to share in his wounds and the wounds of the nonviolent struggle for justice and peace. My friend Martin Sheen, when we got arrested last year with Jane Fonda at Fire Drill Fridays at the U.S. Capitol, for his speech, he stood up and he told a story about somebody died and he appears at the gates of heaven and St. Peter is there and says, oh, welcome, show me your wounds. And the guy says, what do you mean, my wounds? And St. Peter says, was nothing worth struggling for? Was nothing worth suffering nonviolently for or dying for like the nonviolent Jesus? So in other words, what does the peace of Christ mean for you? And how is this resurrection peace connected to his wounds? It's like Bonhoeffer. This is not a cheap peace that we're talking about. It's a costly peace. I'm paraphrasing Bonhoeffer. Third, the other thing in the note in this little scenario is they're totally terrified, and we need to recognize that. Startled and then terrified. And I mean scared to death. So that's part of resurrection. As I said, coming to grips with our fears. But notice he asks a question. He's not scared. And he's like, what's your problem? It's me. Why are you troubled? And why do questions arise in your hearts? This is important. It's something about when we suddenly realize we are in the presence of God, we get scared and troubled and terrified. We have all these questions. And he says, why are you doing that? There's no reason to be troubled. So I think resurrection invites us to really spend time with our fears and to do our inner work and sit with our fears and give them to the risen Jesus and more let go of them. Why again Gandhi professed a vow of fearlessness? He said, you can't practice nonviolence and be afraid. You and I don't have to be afraid anymore because our survival is already guaranteed. Our guy is not dead anymore. So there's nothing that should trouble us or disturb us. Now, Dan Bergen showed me that and told me that quietly in many little ways over 40 years. And he went to his death totally unafraid and totally at peace. And he never complained once. He was teaching me until the end. I'm just sharing with you about my teaching. I think there's a way to go forward in deep peace, in deep nonviolence, following the risen Jesus, so that these questions no longer arise. And I see that in Thich Nhat Hanh and other great peacemakers who just live in the present moment of peace. That's why mindfulness is a good practice. You can talk about, we could connect mindfulness and resurrection. I find that really helpful. Fourth, he opens the scriptures for them. In effect, what's so cool is that Jesus does a Bible study, and it's right there in the Gospel of Luke for the early church. It shows Jesus doing a Bible study for the early community, and it gives them courage to keep doing Bible studies and gospel studies. And he explains the movement of God in the scriptures and history and says, okay, now you continue the story. This is our story. But the point is repentance, forgiveness, and peace. All this happens so that repentance could be preached, which means we're going to turn everybody stuck in the culture of violence around into God's reign of nonviolence. Forgiveness. Every human being is going to forgive every person who ever hurt them. This is critical. Forgiveness comes up over and over throughout the Gospels. If you want to enter resurrection, you have to forgive every human being who ever hurt you. Let it all go. General amnesty. And peace, it means that we're going to get on and work for a whole new world without war or injustice or violence ever again. That means preaching to all the nations. And that's what you and I are trying to do. We're trying to be people who go out into the culture and say, turn from violence, turn toward nonviolence, forgive everyone, welcome the reign of peace on earth, and get with the resurrection program of active organizing grassroots movements of nonviolence. And that leads us my fifth point, you are witnesses of these things. That's a great word. And as you know, the Gospel of Luke, or the writer of Luke, also writes the Acts of the Apostles, where the word witnesses of the resurrection appears many times. That's in effect the final commission here. Like many of you, I've been arrested many times. I've been arrested about 85 times in acts of civil disobedience against war, which means I've been in court over 200 or 250 times, often with Ramsey Clark, because you have to keep going back. And many times you have to take the witness stand, and they swear you in, and you have to say what you saw. I remember during the Plowshares trial, I said, I saw Philip Berrigan stand up for the whole human race and try to end war. The judge gave me contempt of court. You can't say that. I was a witness. So the word witness means a lot. It's a courtroom. Your whole life is you're living in a courtroom in the world. And you're testifying what you saw. I saw this happen. Jesus is risen in these movements. There is hope for peace and justice. So what does it mean for you to be a witness of the risen Jesus? How has your life been like you've been on a witness stand? It's not comfortable, but you have to tell the truth and tell what you saw. How do you do that today? What would that look like more and more for the rest of your life to see yourself as a witness? I'm testifying to the resurrection of Jesus. It's just lovely. So I'll conclude how I began, saying that resurrection means having nothing to do with death. I love that phrase. And so that means that you and I are going to try to non-cooperate with a culture of death from now on. That's why I always loved poet Edna St. Vincent Millay. Remember her from the 1920s? She has this incredible poem. I think it's called Civil Objector. And this is just the first line. I shall die, but that is all I shall do for death. I think that sums up our attitude for the rest of our lives. We will die, but we're not serving death anymore. We're people of resurrection. So I don't know if this has all been helpful, but I hope it has, that the story of Emmaus is our story too, and that hopefully we are turning around and going on the road of hope now back to the community to get on with the work. So let me ask you these questions one last time, then I'll open it up. What does resurrection mean for you? What does the resurrection of the nonviolent Jesus mean for you? What does it mean that death does not get the last word? That your survival is already guaranteed. What for you is the connection between resurrection and nonviolence? How have you used the past perfect? What had you hoped? We had hoped. And how are you moving beyond the past perfect toward hope? What makes you turn around? What makes your heart burn? What gives you new hope? Where are you encountering the risen Jesus today? And how are you going to go forth and be his witness, a witness of the resurrection? So, dear friends, thanks so much for your patience and for listening to me.